Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Uh, I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance here in Chicago. For those who are new to our organization, we are a member-supported nonprofit advocating for fast, frequent, and affordable trains across the U.S. One of our core tenets is that high-speed rail doesn't stand on its own. High-speed rail is transformative, but you need a lot of other things going on around it in order for high-speed rail to work, and then high-speed rail makes everything else work better. We call that the integrated network approach. And in my view, it's probably about 80% new high-speed lines where trains are going 200 miles an hour, and the other 80% is shared use with freight. And one of our core tenets is you have to have a national program that's led by the federal government in order to actually make that work. So if you want high-speed rail and you're not part of our organization, please join. We are supported by people like you, and we help you understand why we need fast, frequent, and affordable trains, um, how we can get it built in this country, and steps that can be taken to move it forward in the short term. And we give you the tools you need to educate your elected leaders to do that. So please go to highspeedrail.us and hit that donate button. So Eric Goldwyn is joining us today. He's recently did a report about how to get high-speed rail projects delivered more quickly and more affordably. We kind of, if you look at the underlying solution to each of them, it's this federally led program, hence the name of the program today. But really interesting elements, and really excited to have you here, Eric, to talk about that. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Rick, and thanks everyone at the High Speed Rail Alliance. Thanks to Chris. I don't know if Chris is here, but he's invited me in the past, so I just wanted to give him a shout out. So yeah, I'm gonna share some slides with you. I'm gonna talk, and then hopefully we're gonna talk, and it's gonna be wonderful. Um, so in sort of running through this, I noticed that for some reason in Zoom, when I do full screen, it pauses my sharing. So you get to see some of the good stuff on the side. So I apologize for the lack of surprises. Um, so first of all, the name of the report is Speeding Up Domestic High-Speed Rail Project Delivery. One of the pithier titles I've ever come up with. Um, but the reason for that is just that I, you know, we had been asked to look specifically at that issue, and so that was sort of the focus of the report. And so the title is very straightforward. Sort of the genesis of all of this is that a few years ago, my team at NYU, we'd published a report about the cost drivers of transit projects, and some people who were looking at high-speed rail had asked us to take a look at high-speed rail. I had sort of said, that sounds interesting. I think we can translate some of what we found from our transit research into the high-speed rail research, but I don't pretend that I'm an expert in high-speed rail. Let me sort of root around and see what we can figure out. Sure enough, there were lots of areas of overlap. I talked to lots of people. And so that's sort of the origins, and you'll get the output of all that work. So the outline of the report and sort of the outline of this talk, the talk will focus on the 5 recommendations. But the first thing to note is, the U.S. has been trying to build high-speed rail for quite a while. There have been efforts in different states at the national level, but we have not sort of succeeded. But this time, it does seem like it's different and that we are on the precipice of building true high-speed rail. In doing the research, I spoke to a lot of people who were in this space in the 1990s and early 2000s who thought at that time that they were on the precipice. So let's not, count our chickens before they've hatched. But I do think there are some significant differences, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those are. So yeah, how do we build more and how do we build faster? in order to get this done, we did collect some data on costs and schedules from around the world. That's up on our website, which is transitcosts.com. And I think it's backslash high speed rail or high dash speed dash rail, something like that. But we interviewed 66 experts across the international high-speed rail industry, project sponsors, suppliers, agency officials, and so on. And that's in the US, that's in Spain, it's in France, in England, a couple of East Asian countries as well. We try to look internationally to learn how best to approach these things. And then we developed these 5 key recommendations. Many of them overlap with what Rick laid out at the very beginning. The first and most important thing is federal direction and nurturing local experimentation, technical standards, which is sort of, I would say, sort of secondary of that, stronger links to universities and industry, project management, procurement and risk, and permitting, third-party agreements, and planning. So as I said, the title is a little dry, but the real sort of the subtitle is build the damn train, right? That's really what we need to be doing, and that's the orientation we need to have. And I think that you hear Secretary Buttigieg or the president talk about some of the stuff, and they don't use these exact words, but I think this is sort of the mentality that they're adopting or projecting at least. And I think you also hear it with Governor Newsom has sort of, I think, redoubled his support and interest in getting this done. And there are other actors who I think are not totally shying away from sort of this mentality. And I think that that is critical. We do need champions. We do need leaders who sort of are pushing this thing forward. So let's talk about greater federal direction and nurturing local experimentation. The reason why I've included these 2 images is just to sort of remind us, this is not the first time we've been down this path. We have developed national plans. There has been some federal direction. It just has not been continuous, well funded, and sort of uniformly agreed to amongst people in this country. So I think that was sort of the first thing that stood out when talking to people in Spain or in France, or people who studied what's going on in China or in Japan, is that there is disagreement about where they should build high-speed rail, but there is not disagreement about building high-speed rail. Everyone sort of agrees, it seems, that it should be done. It should be a national priority. There should be special privileges for these programs. Here in the U.S., it is there's much less agreement, much less unanimity, and much more polarization around all these things. So I think that sort of contributes to this process. But I want to focus a little bit on the nurturing local experimentation piece. So one of the things I thought was quite interesting in sort of doing some reading and talking to some people was that if you look at sort of new mode networks in the U.S., say the original railroads, the highway system, the canal system, they didn't start with the federal government saying, here's a map, here's some lines, let's get it done. It did start off with, private actors and, states often, you know, buying, the stocks of those companies or whatever it is, some sort of version of a public-private partnership, sort of proving the concept of these different modes. And then as those networks get built out and more states are doing it, the federal government responds with, okay, we'll do a wraparound and get this thing done. I think what we've seen with high-speed rail, however, when it comes to local experimentation, getting the money organized to build these projects has just been too difficult. When you look at sort of projects, there was a project proposing to connect LA and San Diego. They ran into this issue, just they could not raise enough money. In Texas with the Texas TGV, similar sort of challenges. What Brightline has done in Florida, obviously is a model and is very exciting. And I think what they're doing out on the West Coast, where they are, they've put up some money. And I think what California has done with California High Speed Rail is, the state of California has put up some serious money. And there was a quote in one of the papers that I was reading, is that until a local entity or a private actor is willing to put up, really significant money, billions of dollars, it's never going to happen. And so I think, we are at a point where that has happened, and the federal government has also come in with billions of dollars to support these programs. So I think, that puts us in a very different place than we've ever been before. And so I think that that's quite exciting. But getting back to sort of the federal direction piece, what we really need is maybe it's the FRA, maybe it's Amtrak, maybe it's some other entity that has a plan. In China, they have 5-year plans that are funded. And if you don't, meet that 5-year plan, it's not good for your career, apparently. But what we need is, instead of yearly allocations, we need a program, right? We need to fund a 5-year, a 10-year, whatever the right number of years is, program to get some of this stuff going. Because going by dribs and drabs has been very difficult in California, has, sown a lot of uncertainty into that program. And I think we'd like to avoid that going forward. It's a little bit chaotic, I would argue. Um, so let's talk about recommendation 2. So technical standards. One of the things that we are lacking here in the US is agreed to standards for what high-speed rail should look like. So in this image, we're showing, standard American freight rail, the heavy rail. That's 136-pound rail. This is the European standard high-speed rail, UIC 60, and then this is the Japanese standard high-speed rail. Right? They're all different. Um, if you think about what's going on with Brightline West, California High-Speed Rail, and Texas Central, sort of the three projects in, relatively advanced states, um, of at least design or planning. They all three of them are sort of interested in different rail standards, and the reason why that's important, right, is that that has an impact on the rolling stock, right, and the wheel rail interactions. And if you think about integration of these systems, and obviously Texas and California High Speed Rail are not going to be linked up anytime soon, but one could see with the High Desert Corridor program, California High Speed Rail and Brightline West connecting. And if they have different rolling stock, I mean, if they have different tracks, um, what does that mean for the rolling stock? How do those programs integrate? Is everyone going to have to get off the train, and then switch to another one? Or it would be better if at the national level we said, you know what, we're going to go with UIC 60, let's say, which is what California High Rail had wanted to pursue initially, and I think they're still looking at it, but have had some trouble procuring it. Um, or Texas Central is committed to adopting full Shinkansen standards, and so that runs at odds with this. And then Brightline West, to my knowledge, is they're pushing forward with 136-pound rail, the American standard, because they want to get moving, right? Like they have debt that they have to pay off. So they're not interested in waiting around while, someone figures this stuff out. Now, having different, rail heads is not necessarily the end of the world. Like we can solve some of those problems, but this also has to do with, traction power systems. It has to do with, platform heights. It has to do with rolling stock, right? There are lots of other areas where, we can see, greater standardization helping to sort of just send out to the marketplace. It's like, we know what we're doing. This is what we want. This is what it's going to look like. Let's go forward. Let's sort of reproduce the widget rather than reinvent the wheel, to use a lot of funky metaphors. And standardization, what we found in our transit research, is just a great way to speed up project delivery, you know, give assurances to manufacturers that, okay, this is the design. I can try to, perfect it in my own way, and then we can go forward. And I think that's so exciting about high-speed rail is that it exists in lots of places, right? We're not at a phase of, we don't know what this looks like. We don't know what we should do. So let's, be cautious. We do know what we should do. We do know what it looks like. We just need to make a decision. And I think that's a really important thing to do. And so just to sort of underscore this point about how different standards look different and, have challenges with interaction and integration, we overlaid the three rail heads And you can see, right, the American standard, the one in that reddish orange, is a little taller. The UIC 60 and the darker blue is a little, fatter than the Japanese standard. And so you can see that this has some impact on that wheel rail interaction. And let's, you know, let's resolve that problem now rather than building systems that don't interact and integrate in the future. That's a problem that they had in Europe, but they've addressed that, right? They've decided to focus on interoperability going forward. Let's not make those same mistakes as we press forward in the 21st century. Okay. Recommendation 3 is about broader links to universities and industry. Um, the thing to me that is important here and that I saw in the research is not that I'm at a university and NYU needs to, I don't know, whatever, get more money to study this stuff. NYU does not have real rail engineering, so this is not about NYU. But when you look at advances made in Germany or in Japan or in France, a lot of it did relate to advances made at universities about traction power and developing the railway engineers and all those things. But it built a constituency of experts who could advocate for these projects and who could actually carry them out. I think that's the other side of this is, do we have the workforce? And I don't mean on the craft labor side, I mean on the engineering side and the design side that has enough experience with all of this stuff to get it done. If we are serious about having sort of a national program, we should have a workforce that is up to the task. And so I found these programs. I'll talk a little about the Rail Tech one at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that they do really focus. They have classes in high-speed rail, and they are producing engineers that work at the Brightline West and work at the different rolling stock companies and so on and so forth. And I just think if you think about um, producing all of this stuff, you have to have that human capacity. We can't just stand up a new industry and expect it to work without any assistance. And when you talk to people working on these programs, you talk to engineers from all over the world who will say it's like, we don't have sort of the depth on our bench here in the U.S. So we're bringing in people from France, people from Spain, people from Germany, people from East Asia and so on, to help us out. All that is great, and we should learn from those who have done this stuff. But we also should be investing in our own abilities to carry this stuff out. And again, I think the best thing we can do is then link that knowledge being produced in the universities with the AECOMs, the Alstoms, the Brightline Wests, and create a pipeline of graduates who have been trained in the classroom but maybe not as experienced in the field with that field experience so that they can go out there and get this work done. And I think this is not a new idea. This is a thing that has happened forever. But just we need to start doing that in the U.S. The example that sticks out in my mind always is I think in China there's a university that is just about developing high-speed rail engineers, right? They pump out thousands of them a year. We have nothing remotely similar to that. And I'm not saying we need to go in that direction, but I think we definitely do need to improve our education. And the other side of this is that the federal government does fund sort of transportation research at universities all over the country. If you look at the transportation bill, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. It's in the report, but there's a few $100 million in there for the different research centers in the U.S. to study, transportation related things. None of them are really studying high-speed rail in any meaningful way. There was a group at UIC, I don't know if they're at the Urbana-Champaign campus or not, that is looking at I think it's like viaduct construction and precasting and things like that, which is obviously is very relevant for, crossings and things like that. So anyhow, I think a really good thing to focus on is how do we improve all of these connections. Okay, so this is one of my favorite slides because who the hell could make sense of this? I mean, it is so boring. But this is talking about project management, procurement, and risk. And I don't know how to in one image um, convey that effectively. And so we've lumped a lot of these things together because a lot of it relates to this idea of risk and de-risking. Procurement strategies are devised around sort of how does the public client sort of offload risk effectively, which sort of explains a big movement away from the conventional design bid build. And then on the management side, um, it's, who is in charge, right? Is it your program management consultant, or is it, your client, the public entity, a California High-Speed Rail Authority, to use an example. Our in our research on transit, and I think some of the lessons learned so far with procurements out here is that you really need a strong, capable client. Let's focus on the public sector. We'll leave Brightline West out of it for the time being. They really need to sort of control and define the project at the outset, know what they want. And then they have to be able to sort of manage and control scope effectively and, direct their consultants effectively. I think what we're seeing is that, and this is definitely true on the transit side, we have public agencies that, are not necessarily well staffed, and they're not chock full of subject matter experts in, the different domains that they need. So they rely very heavily on their consultants to define the project and then maybe realize, oh, we need to do something different. And so they change up the game midway through. And, that creates delay, that creates change orders, that creates not always the best feelings between contractors and public agencies. And so, again, and this is where at the federal level, if you had sort of a high-speed rail oversight group, or, an Amtrak, many countries around the world have these sort of public benefit corporations setups like our Amtrak, where they have, subject matter experts who they rely on consultants, but they use fixed contracts, fixed price, fixed schedule. They manage the consultants with subject matter experts. When something doesn't make sense or the consultant wants some direction, they're able to direct them effectively. I'm drawing a lot on interviews we did with some of the Spanish experts we talked to, and I think that's something that is missing here. And so we can talk about design build, construction manager at risk, all of integrated project delivery. We can talk about any different procurement strategy you want, but that really is downstream of having a capable and competent client who can define its project and manage its consultants effectively. If we can't do that, it doesn't matter what procurement strategy we use, we will not be able to de-risk in an effective way. And I think, we've seen in some of the projects that exist, these problems we've seen these problems over and over again. Okay. So I want to talk about permitting, third-party agreements, and planning. So this, very much on the public sector side of things. So in our transit work, one of the things that I came to learn a lot about was how these third parties, and so a third party um, on the public side is going to be like a Department of Transportation or a Department of Public Works or any other public agency you interact with when you're building a transit project or here a high-speed rail project. So in this image that we've shown, as high-speed rail goes through Shafter, it has agreed to build sort of six um, grade separations. And of those six grade included in those six grade separations for the high speed rail, they're also building six grade separations for the BNSF freight rail, right? So even though the high speed rail does not intersect or cross over in what I've shown, California High Speed Rail has agreed um, to build grade separations for the freight railroad in order to get sort of buy-in from the community. And so what you find in a lot of these projects, especially these mega projects that are billions and billions of dollars, is that localities are able to really extract a lot of capital works that, they either can't pay for, don't want to pay for, or, they just see someone else who's willing to pay for it. Um, and so in the case of Shafter, they sued the California High Speed Rail Authority, and in the resolution of that lawsuit, the California High Speed Rail Authority agreed to spend, I think their estimate is about $300 million, to grade separate, these six locations. The federal government gave California Speed Rail just recently a $202 million grant, but California Speed Rail agreed to do this in 2018. So way before they got this grant, they agreed that they would do these grade separations. Um, and again, right, $300 million, not sort of an insignificant number. But these third party agreements and these permitting fights often lead to things like, going to be a lot about sewage. It's always about pipes. Pipes always, factor into this, especially on the transit side. But whenever you're ripping stuff up, of course, there's going to be disruption. Of course, you're going to need to replace things, and big projects should absolutely replace all the things that they disrupt. But the challenge is like, where are those boundaries drawn? And so I think for the reason why I focus so much on Shafter is that the parallel grade separation is just, it's very clear that it has nothing to do with the California High-Speed Rail program. Grade separations in general are fantastic. Shafter had said it's like in their priorities that they want these grade separations done. The state of California even has these six locations in its like statewide plan on grade separations. But again, it's the California High-Speed Rail Authority that is now, paying for this. And I think that's that's an abuse of the project. And I think it's what saddles these projects with sort of this reputation of being incapable of getting the job done on time and on budget. And I think if we were more clear and more honest about what's going on and we could separate them out clearly, that would be better for these projects. And the reason why I focus on this is that in the planning phase, there's this emphasis on getting through the environmental process, getting through NEPA or CEQA, if you're in California, or both of them, of course. And what that means is that you devise a project that can get through that process. You don't devise a project that is constructible. And I think what we've seen on California high-speed rail, especially with specifically utility relocation issues, because moving a telecom cable is not a huge environmental impact, it's not something that is a lot of time is spent on figuring out in the planning process. Like the incentive again is to get through NEPA so you can get your big federal chunk of money and then figure out those problems later. And I think what we'd rather see is that we are devising and developing plans that are constructible, and we can, send out to contractors and go, shovels in the ground and get moving on. And, on the first set of contracts for California High-Speed Rail, they've spent an inordinate amount of time and money sort of figuring out this utility relocation issue. Um, I think that project, I think, the first contract is now four times over, what the initial projection was, several hundred millions of dollars, in addition to I think it was planned for $60 million, have been filtered into utility relocation work. Um, and so I think, again, if the emphasis were on what is constructible, what can we get done, rather than what we'll get through this process, I think, that would change things dramatically. And again, that all comes back to having sort of the capacity to do the planning process right from the beginning, to have confidence that the planning that you're doing is going to lead to something that is constructible and will be constructed and is not going to fall victim to politics. There's a really great example, um, in the section for California Expo where they go by the Cesar Chavez National Monument, where they redesigned it, I think, more than 10 times. Um, they initially proposed to be, I think it was 300 feet away from the National Monument, then 400 feet away, then 800 feet away, then 2,000 feet away. They're building, some tunnel, some berms. It's going to add another, $1 billion, I believe, to the project. And, there's an existing freight railroad right of way, even closer. But because you gotta sort of get along to go along. If the governor is not sort of supporting you, actively, or the state legislator is not supporting you actively, it creates sort of all of these problems. And so I think what we need to see is, greater support from our state legislatures and our governors at the outset of these projects, sort of requiring permitting agreements with timelines and with, consequences for not adhering to them. In Canada, there are a couple examples of from transit projects where you have 60 days to approve a permit application. If you don't approve it, the project moves forward. There's nothing like that in the United States, as far as I've found on the transit side. And I think we need to operationalize time much more effectively. The other thing that you can do, right, is you can grant master permitting authority to the project sponsor once it's been approved. And that way, if someone wants to a permit to move something or build something, they need to get the approval of the project first, which I don't think is a bad idea either. But we need to find some ways to tilt the balance of power back towards the projects, because these entities like California High-Speed Rail Authority, or pick any transit agency, it's not really clear what powers they have or what they do if something goes wrong, or if someone wants to fight with them, right? So if, like, the city of Shafter is like, we're not going to give you a permit, um, what can California High Speed Rail Authority do? There needs to be another party that steps in and says, you know what, Shafter, you need to get out of the way of this project. It's a national priority. Let's move forward. And when you look at high-speed rail projects across the world, they all have some kind of mechanism that, once they get sort of this national approval, local planning has to adapt to the national project and not vice versa. And I think, we really need to figure that piece out, and we really need to emphasize how important that is. There's a lot of nibbling around, smaller issues, but as long as there's this imbalance in power, these projects are always going to be sort of mired in lawsuits or delays, or just review and review and review. And I just wanted to show quickly sort of what it's going to look like when they build these viaducts. Um, so sorry, it's an animation. We'll start at the beginning a second. So this is Shafter. Um, and I got these drawings after the report was published. So this is the existing conditions. They're going to remove the freight track and put it in the middle, build the viaduct on one side. Okay. And then, take it over and then build a viaduct on the other side. So California High Speed Rail will be on one side, and then BNSF will be on the other side. I don't want it to get a headache, so I'll just go back to this one. And so, right, this Shafter is going to be forever changed in terms of its context, and what it looks like and feels like, and the shadows and all that stuff, because there's going to be two viaducts now running, straight through the city, as you can see sort of in this image. And is that the best case solution? I don't know. I think we probably could have come up with something a little bit better. Um, anyway, I'm going to stop for now. So, thank you. I think I've talked for about 35 minutes. But I'd love to hear some questions. I see there's some stuff going on in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'm going to look at that too. But feel free to send me an email. Feel free to check out the report, and let's get into it.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how this relates totally, but I've been looking into the Penn Station, New York issues,
Hmm.
um, and Amtrak's desire to build a new stub end terminal in Manhattan. And one of the challenges is that there were three railroads coming into that station that were all privately held.
Hmm.
There's a fourth that they would like to get in there that was built as a different entity. Um, and so there are four different electrification standards. I was surprised to find out there's actually two different standards for how far the platform is set from the center of the track.
Hmm.
And the signaling systems are all different.
Hmm.
Um, so that leads to a desire to have had some sort of standard back around 1900 when they were
Sure.
building these things. But it's also true that in 1900, it wasn't really clear what the right way to do electrification was,
Yes.
what the right. So how do you balance between, we've all got to agree, but there has to be the ability to innovate in the future?
Right. Well, so I think if you look at sort of third rail electrification versus like overhead catenary systems, or overhead contact systems, um, it's been sort of decided ever in the world that overhead is more efficient, less expensive, and that is what, you know, we should be doing versus, third rail. And now there are legacy systems that have third rail, obviously New York City subway, but Long Island Railroad or Metro North expand, should they be expanding with third rail? Probably not. They probably should be using, especially outside of the city. And so I think in 1900 or whenever, when we're figuring these things out, like of course it makes sense that you should let things play out a little bit and you should sort of judge based on real projects in the world. But the thing that's so cool about high-speed rail is that, right, the Japanese are celebrating their 60th anniversary. Like it's not new technology. It's not you know, a new thing. It's not like when Bart was trying to automate the trains and all those things. It's like this stuff has been done. We can look at examples from all over the place, and we can make some decisions. Uh, I think the other thing that's great about standards, right, is that as you have a standard, people can then bring to bear on that innovation, right? And you can say, okay, let's try to make this overhead catenary even better, like, different tension or, whatever it is, different materials. Let's see how we can, get traction, the substations even farther apart. So we build fewer of them. Like once everyone is rowing in the same direction, like that kind of stuff can happen. But if everything is sort of bespoke and a one-off, like everyone's moving in a different direction. And so I think, with high speed rail and with, passenger rail in general, like this is not, uh, you know, uncharted territory. Like, we don't have high speed rail, right? Like let's get it. Let's copy what they did somewhere. Um, and then, once we have some expertise, once we've gotten, we're developing that stuff, then we can get clever and cute and experiment a bit more. But I think right now we're at a point where we really just need to copy and paste, um, develop some of that muscle in terms of the different systems and different components, and then we can really innovate going forward. And then, as you're talking, just getting to the Penn Station thing, right? Like having different railroads share, without standards is silly. It's like if there were a standard, you could have four different railroads sharing and they'd all have like pretty much the same stuff. And, you could design effectively. But if you have, you know, currently, really three different railroads, with Amtrak and Jersey Transit, and we'll just put the MTA as, as one thing. Um, like and there are no transit standards either. Like there are no standards in that industry either. Um, but the theory there is that like those are very disconnected from other networks, so it's not as important. Although, great example of how they are connected, and how they could be connected. And so I think, standardization in passenger rail and in transit would be really quite good. I think at the federal level, there just is real hesitance to put a firm hand sort of on the scale in one direction or the other. I don't really know why that is. Um, and I think, there's a lot of deference to the grantees, which I think when you see grantees making bad decisions or suboptimal decisions, it's okay to say, you know what? We actually know this is not a good decision. You should maybe you should consider something different if you want our billions of dollars. And I think that, the trade-off of, we, the federal government, are going to give you billions of dollars. Let's use the rolling stock for a second. Like, Brightline West and California Heights Rail each got, 3 billion and change, at the beginning of the year. Like why wasn't there a requirement for joint procurement of rolling stock? Like that seems like, not a bad idea. You get some hopefully economies of scales and efficiencies. It maybe forces the issue of track as well. And so, I think that the federal government could be firmer than it currently is. And I think this is true in transit as well. Sorry. I think I kind of answered your question.
Well, oh, if you could unshare your screen and let's just,
Oh, sure. Sorry.
um, well, I just, uh, it's an interesting question, right? So, uh, Brightline, Florida wanted to have wider trains, which I
Yep.
think is a very good idea, for multiple reasons, because it's easier to get, you can set the platform back, which means freight trains can go by it. So we've got to figure out how to get level boarding on shared use systems. And I think that's probably the answer. More comfortable interiors if the train's wider, et cetera. But the people who financed the trains themselves said you have to be able to get these into Penn Station,
Hmm.
right? Which results in a narrower train than is ideal. So there's this concern I have with sometimes if you get too strict, then you end up without being able to have innovation.
Well,
But you
no,
got to have
no.
standards.
Absolutely. Well, so I think, I talked to a couple engineers, and one engineer, like a veteran, basically was like, you don't want to be overly prescriptive, right? Like even in Europe, there is room for stuff, but you need to, when it comes to the track and the signaling, basically, it's like that stuff needs to be uniform. You can mess around, you can, leave some flexibility for some other things, but obviously, like you want the trains to be communicating with signals, especially as you cross different lines and integrate with other other systems. So I think that makes sense, and I think the idea of you a way of creating artificial stub ends, right, is by changing the rail profiles, right? So if you have to like get off and on trains, like this is like a way to ensure there's through running an integrated system if you just are more in sync on some of that stuff. Um, Rick, if you have more questions, by all means, I can also answer some of the ones that have been written up
Yeah,
here. If
absolutely.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. So I just wanted to talk. I think Breck asked, please discuss the culture of state DOTs really being departments of highways. How does U.S. culture shift to mode shift? So I mean, totally agree. I think state DOTs are a real um, mystery, to put it lightly. But I think there is flexibility in how state DOT money is spent. It requires leadership in the state legislature and in the governor's mansion. I think what we're seeing in Virginia is very inspiring in terms of you know spending money on passenger rail. Like they use this term flex. I don't know why flex, but you can take money that you've been allocated for highways and you can spend it on other stuff. You don't have to spend it on highways. um and so I think, right, like breaking out of that mold requires leadership that wants to do that. And again, in Virginia, I don't exactly know what the origin of that was, but they've created something. I'm going to get the name wrong. There's a program called, I think it's Smart Choice, where they take all the different transportation projects in the state and they have like, some wonky rating system where you can sort of see the benefit. It's like essentially a simplified cost benefit analysis. And it's like, this project is going to cost this much. It's the most expensive project and it has the least amount of benefits. So you can do it, but egg on your face, bad decision. Nothing is binding about this process, but it's just to make transparent the costs and benefits of different transportation projects so you can compare against them, which I think is cool. I think we need to have a bit more of that. Um, so I answered that. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes,
Um,
especially in Texas.
yeah, there you go. Oh, well. Oh, sorry.
Anthony,
Oh, sorry. Go. You go. You go. You go.
Anthony Campagna has an interesting question there. I don't know if you see
Let's
that.
see. Anthony Campagna.
Uh,
Yes, I do. On the subject of federal standard. Oh, I'll read it out loud. On the subjects of federal standards and planning, would it make sense for the federal government to produce standard level designs it is willing to support with an eye for maximizing amount of infrastructure completed most efficiently? It seems like the current bottom-up system of planning where localities plan out expensive projects that, yeah, well, I should finish reading the question other than just agreeing with it. Plan out expensive projects that meet a full local wish list. Example, VTA Silicon Valley BART needs to be reversed. Anthony, absolutely. I think if you look at the highway system, that's fundamentally how it worked. Someone always reminds me that even the font on the signs is standard, right? It's I don't know what the font is actually, I should know. But it all looks the same, wherever you're driving on the highway. And I think that that would be a good way. I think right what you're seeing with BART or Hawaii has done something different with its HART program. Not saying I think automated is quite good and we should be moving that direction. But I think right there should be some standards on that. I just K asked a question that I should have talked more about, and I talk about in the report a bit. Is that, do you see the corridor ID program as a step in the right direction toward longer term, better coordinated planning? Absolutely, I love corridor ID. Um, I think grant programs are bad, just to put it very clearly. I think Corridor ID is not perfect, but because it's still a grant program. But I think what it is doing is it is emphasizing creating your, well, what's the term? Your operational planner. I'm getting it wrong. You all probably know it off the top of your heads, but it requires you before you get into environmental sort of identifying the infrastructure you want to build, talking about frequency of service, talking about speed. And I think, that sort of puts the planning first. And I think anything that is putting planning ahead of jumping through all the hoops is a really good is a move in the right direction. Um,
Yeah, I'm
okay.
hoping that
Oh,
they have a lot of public comment at the beginning. One, to make sure that they're selling the program and also to actually get feedback. So hopefully we can get better programs out of it in the end.
yeah, absolutely. John Sharp asked, how about making high-speed rail being funded by transportation the same way DoD is funded? DoD has multi-year projects, and that is how it should be done. High-speed rail should travel on its own tracks versus on freight tracks. So that's a comment and a question. So I completely agree, John. I would like in my mind, what I'd love Amtrak to do or, whatever, is say here's our 10-year plan. It's going to cost this much. This is what we're going to do. And let's go. And if they do it and they do it well, it's like, let's roll it forward. If they do it badly, then, there are consequences for that. I think, unspoken, but sort of undergirding all of this is there has to be accountability and there has to be urgency. One of my favorite stories that I tell over and over again, is I was interviewing someone. I think it was for this work actually, and as an aside, he just was saying that he was working on a convening and they were going to bring the head of the LTA from Singapore to address their group. And 2 weeks before he had to apologize, he couldn't come. And he sent, a deputy in his stead. And he said he couldn't come because there had been I think it was a 15-minute delay on their subway, and he now had to testify in front of, their National Assembly or whatever it was. And, we're well, Rick and I earlier were talking about the North. Oh, no, I think we were talking about the Northeast Corridor just now too. But I think we were talking about it earlier. But they've been having a lot of problems with their electricity and their power lines, and people have talked about it and people have written about it. But has anyone had a meeting in Congress to bring Amtrak to account for itself? And, I think we really need that. We really need more accountability and more urgency. And I think, the two things, go together. The more accountable project leaders are, the more urgent they will also be.
And then out of one of your previous talks, I got out of it, you need essentially a person who can make tough decisions, who is both empowered to make tough decisions and is willing to do it.
Yeah.
Uh, and so an example that may be fictional, so I won't say it specifically, but the shorter way between Fresno and San Jose would cut through one guy's ranch,
Mm.
and he had the power to divert the route a different way, which would affect two or three guys' ranches, but nobody was able to stand up and say, we're doing it this way. It seems like there's lots of places like that where it's like we need to just decide we're going to do something.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there are always going to be there are always people that are unhappy about these things. But again, I think high speed rail is unique in that, it's hopefully, it has a sort of national scope and it is a national priority. California high speed rail is, currently estimated, I think it's $150 billion, whatever it is. Like, what other infrastructure project cost that much money? I mean, I don't know, is it the Hoover Dam? Like this is a national priority to get this right and to do a good job. And if that's the case, like we should, all be sort of pushing for its, success. We will make mistakes, there's no doubt about it. But we can't allow, fear of making a mistake prevent us from doing anything. I mean, the thing about California Ice Rail that drives me so crazy is when you read the initial language in, the 2008 legislation or 2009 legislation, it's like the whole thing is going to be done by 2020. Right? It's 2024. None of it's done. We're not mitigating any of the airplane VMT. We're not mitigating any of the roadway VMT. Like all that GHG is in the atmosphere, all of the congestion, all the road widenings, all, it's all happening. And um, you know, yeah, we have to be willing to make important decisions that are perhaps unpopular. And that's obvious. That's like a deeper issue of political science, and it's always like in all things that's hard. Um, but I think here, it really does make it. I don't think it's impossible. I do really do think we're on the precipice of a different of something new. But I think that's a lot in. I think in large part that's due because so internationally, when you look at high speed rail, it's often there's crowding on the passenger network, on the freight network, and this is like a relief line, or there's an opportunity to rebuild the whole network, to rebuild the network after a war or something like that. In the U.S., the argument that California High Speed Rail has put forward, and Cascadia has adopted this, um, is that widening a highway is just too expensive. Adding another um, runway at an airport is just too expensive or too difficult. I think intellectually that's like a really interesting framing. I don't know that it will be convincing enough. I mean, for me it is, of course, but like I think Seth Moulton, he often talks about those costs, and I think it's a really great framing and makes the case nicely. But I again, we're not uniformly in agreement that there should be high speed rail in this country, um, which not good in my
Yes.
opinion.
So now the client is really wanting to know, how
Oh,
did the Chinese develop their standards for high-speed rail?
yeah. Well, so the Chinese, so in I think 2015, they actually have published, they have standards, for everything, like the way they build the viaduct, everything, it's all standardized. So they have published their standards, but they invited in on the rolling stock side, right? Like they bought trains from everyone, and there was a knowledge sharing agreement, I think is the term. Um, is that the term? There's some, something like that, where they're basically like, look, we're gonna learn to do what you're doing and then do it ourselves. And thank you very much for these 50 trains. Here's some money. Thank you. And so that's what they've done. Again, I think talking about rail for a second. So this UIC 60 rail, the European standard, California High Speed Rail put out a request for inquiries of interest or whatever the RFIQ, whatever that one stands for. Um, and I think they only got one request. One submission. There's only one producer domestically that could potentially do it. And like that makes sense. Like there's no market for this stuff. Like in talking to, manufacturers and producers of goods and items, they're just like, there is no high speed rail market in this country until you can line up a couple different projects. And so I think, we have these Buy America restrictions and things like that are challenging currently. But it's like we need to, if we make we say, hey, California High Speed Rail, Texas Central, Brightline West, Cascadia, whatever, like this is the rail we need. This is the signaling system. I think that would help sort of stimulate um, that market response. And, you know, we would not be China, but it would move us more in that direction of, we have the ability to do this stuff domestically.
Um, so I guess we're getting close to the end.
Oh,
And this
yeah,
is
sorry.
very, very, very interesting. Um, so what are your thoughts on currently relying on state-by-state approvals?
Oh,
Um,
I see the question.
yeah.
What are your thoughts of currently relying on state-by-state approvals process and their ability to act as veto points? Do you see it likely that certain states would willingly participate in a program if they were delegated building projects to a national division? Yes, I should have finished the question, of course. Delegated building project to a national vision like the U.S. Interstate Highway Program. I do think that, I think that's where the standards piece comes in, right? It's saying, you know, and the federal direction, right? Like, we draw the lines. This is what you build. If you want to build it, maybe some of them like, we'll just like force them to be done. But if you want to build it, like we'll pay for, 80%, 90%, whatever the number is, and like go forth and prosper. I do think that would be a really good model. And again, I think Amtrak has like hinted in that direction. Um, but again, the way that they get their funding is not in this. I mean, other than NBIL, like they don't get several $billion over a 10-year period. Like every transit agency in the country has like, a 5-year, a 10-year, or whatever number of year capital program. And even if it's not funded, it's like it lays out the vision of what they're trying to do. And I think, Amtrak has sort of done that in the Northeast Corridor. They've laid out that vision, but like now we need to come through with the funding and sort of get, it all moving in the right direction.
Excellent. I think we should
It's
wrap this.
RFEI, John. RFEI, request for expressions of interest is what I was trying to say. Not RFQ, request for qualifications. But I just saw your comment come up. You know,
Yes.
sometimes you have a senior moment.
So this is really, really very helpful material. I'm really glad that you did this. And then as I recall, your next one is electrification and what we need
We're
to do to electrify
Yeah, we're
rail.
we're doing some stuff on electrification. We're doing a more granular look at the Northeast Corridor as well. That should be done before the end of this year. And like we have a lot of cool like interactive tools. You can see all the different stuff along the Northeast Corridor. It's very exciting. This report was meant to sort of like start at the national scale, and then now we're focusing a bit more on some things, electrification being one of them. Passenger rail just in general, right? Like electrification, like I love the Caltrain project. It's like my favorite thing in the world right now. Just showing that just by electrifying 20% savings in time, right? Like don't have to do anything else. Just like the dwells, the speed, it's like amazing. Like I mean, everyone should just be, how do we have any diesel trains? Like it's just like the dumbest thing ever. Like after this. Like we should have a huge program. Like if I were the secretary, I would just be like, I'm setting up an electrification program, whatever bajillion dollars, and let's just electrify as much as we can. And the thing that I like about that is that I think that also can help us in an incremental way build high speed rail. Like right, if we start electrifying some of these rights of way, I think that could be a way to get us in that mindset of building high speed rail.
I agree completely.
Ah, well,
Well,
that's why we get along.
well, thank you again for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks to the audience for coming. If you liked this program, if you want more like it, highspeedrail.us and hit that become a member button. And Eric, I hope you'll come on when you've got something to say about the Northeast Corridor or electrification
Always,
or
always.
both.
Or I'll send one of my colleagues who has been more involved in it. Who. But yes, always. We love your group, and this has been fascinating and great. And I'm looking forward to, the future talks. Sorry that Seth Moulton canceled on the last one. I was very excited to see him talk.
Yeah, we're getting close to him coming, rescheduling.
All
So
right, great.
great. Thank you. And we will
Thank
talk
you.
again. Yeah,
Bye.
bye.